Right, well, there's no time like the present.
Hello.
You're listening again to About Buildings and Cities. This is the second part of our exploration of the work of Leon Battista Alberti. We've done one book, and now we're going to do the buildings.
Yeah, we're not going to do the other dozen or so books.
Unless they creep into the bonus somewhere.
Yeah, there's stuff to read. Like, let's see about that.
If you want stuff to read, there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, it's all very dense and rambling.
But pure Ciceronian Latin, George.
Yeah, yes, pure Ciceronian Latin, yes. Better than Cicero.
Oh, we should
He
say
says so.
we should say for clarification, I'm Luke Jones.
I'm George Kinjal.
And I am Matt Roberts,
Yeah.
usual editor,
Yeah.
sometime
Sometime
participant.
contributor. Yeah, when we want to raise the tone a bit. And we have a sort of vaguely worked out plan of how we're going to do this.
Strong emphasis on vaguely.
Well, what can you say about the buildings generally? There are lots of problems. One is that none of them really are finished. Another of them is that it's very hard to be sure that he actually did any of them.
For the purposes of today, we're just going to assume he did.
So the whole, analysing Alberti's buildings is a bit of a speculative exercise. At one level, you're thinking, did he do it? And at another level, you're thinking, what was the thing which he was trying to do? Because this obviously wasn't it.
And also, there's almost none of them are tabula rasa, as it were. None of them are like Alberti creations in isolation. They're all stuck onto the front of, or on top of, or around and about pre-existing bits and bobs, which obviously is true of most architectural constructions, but complicates our provenance questions.
I also often think, even if it had been done in the way that he'd sort of intended, it wouldn't be necessarily have the intended effect. Because I think he was really reaching for something that he had a spiritual sort of, or spirit idea of, but found very hard to grasp.
I think we're making it sound like they're not interesting and wonderful things. I think that we've been to a few, and then there are some others which are enticingly present on the internet in the form of photographs, and they are strange and rather captivating.
They're all worth, what's the definition of 3 Michelin stars?
Vol le voyage, I
They're
think.
all vol le voyage, even the smallest, junkiest one, I would say.
Well, is that worth a journey?
The Michelin stars are if you're going by, worth a detour and worth a trip.
They are respectively
Excellent.
vol le visite, détour, and voyage. Yeah. So, well, I guess we'll kind of get into them in a little bit. We probably want to do our favourite thing, which is to sort of waffle on about context.
One of the things that is important to get in our heads when we try to place ourselves back in the 15th century in Italy is that a lot of the structures that we take for granted when it comes to government, state, organisation of society didn't exist. Italy itself was a fractured and complex system of city-states that had interlinking relationships with each other. The papacy acted as a sort of overarching system of societal organisation and control, but then also so did the Holy Roman Empire. And all these small cities are wrangling with each other for trade, through war. Italy as a peninsula is splintered.
Also very rich, though.
Yeah, well, bits of it are, and the north is. So, for me, I would say there's this long process which is going on in the north of Italy, and I don't know why Italy is so successful, but it's somehow being on the edge of empires seems to allow people to be dynamic. So even in the early days, when the Byzantine Empire is falling apart, you're getting little cities popping up in Italy, which are notionally part of the Byzantine Empire, but don't do anything about it. And suddenly they're going and taking weird islands in the, Black Sea, or suddenly they're getting money off the Arab Emirates, and there's something about this sort of space. And at times, there will be a great power in Italy, which will come and sort of take everything over. There's a couple of hundred years before the time we're talking about, when one of the Holy Roman Empires managed basically to solidify control of the peninsula, Frederick II, because he was sort of an Italian. He was a very enlightened man. He was a great scientist. He would have his prisoners run round before he'd execute them, and he'd feed some of them and not others, and then he'd have them chopped up and see the effect it had on their digestion. I mean, they're also having a renaissance every, 100 years. There's a renaissance in the, 10th century, there's one in the 12th, 13th century, there's sort of one in the 14th, 15th. They've got different... I mean, the main one is the main one, but there's a lot of interesting things going on in there.
Do you want to unpack what you mean when you use that word a little bit? What do we mean when we say Renaissance?
So again, I will explain it from my perspective, which is that I grew up here in England, and in England, classical culture is foreign, really. I mean, the Romans were here, and they left some ruins, but there was nothing much to speak of, and...
We're kind of in with the Nordics, aren't we? We discovered about classical culture in early modernity, in the 17th century or something. And
sure, Irish monks were speaking very good Latin, but they were speaking very good Latin because they had to learn it. Whereas people in the more civilizable parts of Europe, where you can grow olives and wine,
Terra Masalata, it just comes gushing out of the ground.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Strike grappa out of every mountain rock. They had a different relationship because you can't not be inspired by Rome when you've got 40,000 seater marble stadium that you're camping in the middle of in a hut.
Yes.
You can't think, there's something to learn off here, and that stuff never went away. And so in England, you can be pretty sure if there's a pediment and a Corinthian capital, it's not from the 10th century. But they never stopped using these things. And also, there were always monasteries around which had classical texts. I mean, sure, we got a lot of stuff, from Arab translations from the East, go into Greek and then into Arabic and then through Spain. But you also got a lot just from going up to Monte Cassino and having a look through the old library. And they were getting books out of that. And so every now and again, ambitious young folk will go into some monastery and dig out another book of Aristotle, and go, oh, cool, isn't this interesting? Let's get onto this chap, which is how Vitruvius came. And they're still doing that in Alberti's time. So it's a place where you can have rebirths of knowledge and classical and sort of rediscover parts or aspects of the form. When we say it's a Renaissance, we don't think that it's the same as ancient Rome. It's very different. And this is going to be an interesting dynamic playing out in Alberti because he's sincerely looking at the ruins of Rome and making something very different and syncretic. There are some other things, yes, as we said, there aren't states, and there hasn't been for a long time. This part of, Europe, it really goes from sort of Rome right up to the North Sea, is kind of the bit between France, Germany, and possibly the papacy, and various powers in that area will struggle sort of the bits of territory and will hold some bits more than others and sometimes will control the whole thing. But there's a lot of land in between, which is potentially quite rich land, where local powers and peoples can have an awful lot of autonomy.
Yeah, and it tends to be characterized by these dense networks of elites who don't all tend to offer up allegiance to the same singular figure as they do in France, for example.
Both, yeah. But like in France, you could be allied to the King of France, but also be an Occitan who sometimes swears allegiance to the Count of Barcelona. Or you could be owner of a farm in Dithmarsh, notionally allied to the bishop of wherever it is that they are, but really just managing your own affairs. And we talk about elites, and they are elite, but some of these communities are pretty small. They're the elites who owned a big farm, going up to people who were more powerful than some of the nations. So
yeah, well, I think that's good, isn't it? Because that establishes also who's paying for the buildings. Yeah. And they are people who do a bit of war in the daytime and a bit of culture in the evenings.
So what happens when you don't have any government and there's no real control? Well, people who effectively control money and armies fight each other for land. And they fight each other for land sort of in and outside of the state systems, because some of these small sort of areas of control, they might be a duchy ruled by a duke, but the duke may be overthrown every now and again by different competing families, or it may be a republic, like lots of these mercantile republics. And the families may move between, that are very powerful in one, may move between them and take over different ones, and it's all very complicated.
It is complicated, yeah. Because also it's not pure survival of the fittest, is it?
No.
You can't just rise up from nothing and be a duke and have the same status as someone who's born into that kind of role.
And people still, these states, some of them have very established traditions that they held to very closely, and ideas that are attractive to us now in sort of different forms were very attractive and powerful for people then. A lot of people wanted to be in a republic rather than a monarchy. And poor people wanted not to be in a plutocracy. It's just they didn't really. Occasionally, they got to voice that complaint. But
one of the ideas I wanted to sort of vocalize with reference to this idea of inherent nobility and whether people can be self-made and rise up above their station is that the literature and the traditions of classical antiquity, which we've already alluded to, do loom so large in the political and social organization of these places, and ideas that are derived from the Roman Republic about whether or not you're a sort of member of the patrician senatorial class or whether you are, like Cicero was, a sort of novus homo. These people are thinking in these terms. They're thinking in Roman Republican terms when they think about the Republic of Florence in the 15th century.
Yeah, well, I mean, before you invent the idea of a Renaissance, you kind of have to invent the idea that you're not Romans anymore.
When people say what the Renaissance is and what it's about, and then they identify the cultural products of the Renaissance, those are actually two different eras, aren't they? They're like 100 years apart. And we're sort of in the latter stages of the actual rebirth, rediscovery of classical antiquity bit. But actually we're very early on in the story of the cultural products and the art of the Renaissance, so-called.
After a while, the word Renaissance becomes unhelpful.
Yes.
Because it's the whole thing, and it's a particular thing, and it's also a number of different particular things. So they're working within the confines of classical culture. There is an expansion of knowledge. The expansion of knowledge of classical culture had been going on in a pretty continuous and growing level for a couple of 100 years by this point. And is reaching a sort of degree of maturity and is really branching out into all of the elite kind of material culture, whereas before it probably was kind of more patchy. When the Renaissance is, when these sort of ideas are going on like alongside the Gothic, there is a competing idea, imported idea of what elite culture is like. Whereas now it becoming the main mode.
But it's risky to see that process in too starker terms of like a sudden eruption of the Renaissance happens now. Before it was not, and now it is.
It's not like the singularity or something.
Yeah.
I think we should talk a bit about architecture. So
Yes.
I think the key thing about this period then, in that we've sort of sketched how power works, is if you want to build buildings, then you have to be in with either one of these sort of local strongmen or with one of the rich families who would have been together in one of the larger cities or settlements. Those are the people who are building. Those are the people or they're the people.
Guilds, or Brunelleschi's biggest patron is the guild that he's a member of, and the city of Florence itself. I mean, who pays for buildings? States and rich people.
And also, who is interested in pushing the culture forward? It tends to be people who are interested in being patrons. They're interested in kind of being identified with with those kind of cultural products. So it's not just, I don't know, we need a bigger church or whatever, but it's also...
I mean, why do you need a bigger church? You need a bigger church because you want to be cooler than those horrible mutts in Siena who, do all sorts of terrible things.
So anyway, here we are. We're sort of in 1450.
Yeah.
Life's great.
Life's great. Yeah, and I guess the sort of local conditions before that is there was a Black Death in the mid 14th century. There was a pretty spectacular economic recovery. There was a lot of war. There's the previous generation of artists and architects. The first sort of the big, you had Giotto in art, and then
Who's the guy we went to see his lovely frescoes in Florence?
Oh, Masaccio, and it's very good. Very good. We'll have Masaccio.
Masaccio is the Trinita where there's the linear perspective.
That's not as good as the Brancacci Chapel. The Brancacci Chapel's way better than that one, in my opinion.
But in terms of innovation in the form and things, I think this is sometimes credited in some places with being one of the first or one of the early linear perspective frescoes where it's incorporated into the architectural frame of the actual building of the wall that it's painted on.
Yeah, but this is right before he was a contemporary of Brunelleschi. That's the generation
just before
Alberti. And Alberti's contemporaries would be like Michelozzo in architecture, Piero Francesca in painting, who has a grip on perspective which is uncanny and weird. He always has everyone's heads at very slightly different kind of rotations because he just loves doing the perspective on people's heads. It's his favorite thing. I think he's amazing.
The great kind of architectural feat that is the prelude to Alberti starting to design and to build is the topping off of the dome on the Duomo at Florence by Brunelleschi.
Brunelleschi does that for the whole of his career, really. It's one of the first things he does, and he finishes off.
Alberti's earliest returns to Florence after he's been out and about.
Well, he doesn't spend really any of his youth there because
they've been exiled. But his return in the papal train, if you like, amongst the papal team in his mid-20s is to celebrate Brunelleschi finishing a phase of the building of the dome, I think.
Yeah, that's another thing that's worth saying, that these people knew each other. He used project architects, and a lot of the project architects were Brunelleschi's assistants and sort of apprentices. So there's a real... And that's kind of how the system worked.
Yes, well, I mean, and the whole story of that dome is one of these, great, heroic triumph stories of Renaissance technology. Very ingenious. Probably not something to go into now, but...
I've always found it much less interesting. I love Brunelleschi's buildings for this sort of, amazing geometric, harmony they have. You go and the dome is a mighty work of engineering, but I've never found it so exciting.
It's also a very interesting work of brick architecture, of which, of course, Alberti is an aficionado. So, well, I think that's a good place maybe to move on to what sort of an issue in the buildings generally. So one of the ways in which we should think about them is, in a way, he's moving things on from Brunelleschi. Or that's one of the ways to read them, is there are certain things in Brunelleschi's kind of canonization or formulation of classical architecture that he likes, and certain things that he's not into at all, and he wants to move it on. I think in general, it's still not really clear what classical architecture is, and he's sort of trying to work out.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't exist yet as an idea.
But it kind of will exist in about 50 years or something.
Yeah. He's one of a handful of people that are, the way it was traditionally, historically taught, you'd say, there's Brunelleschi, then there's, Alberti, then
Bramante,
and then Michelangelo, then Palladio.
Yeah.
And then we're in full swing. And then we're onto the Baroque people. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's not a terrible idea. But what that shows you is we're only 25% of the way in to coming up with the idea.
And in fairness, that whilst that kind of heroic narrative might not necessarily be wholly accurate in looking back at it. It is what the people at the time thought was happening. People like Vasari, the first like biographers of the Renaissance as it was happening, definitely subscribed to this like lineage, the passing on of the baton.
Although it's worth saying, he was like 2 generations later, when we are, instead of being 25% of the way through, we're like 80% of the way through, and you can kind of see. I think for them it would be less clear.
When you look at Alberti's buildings, there are particular sort of architectural problems which he is being drawn back to again and again and kind of wrestling with. The one which really jumps out to me is that facades are very important, particularly on classical buildings. The front facade, the way in which that's kind of geometrically assembled, articulated, the way in which it brings together these different references to classical buildings and these sort of assemblages of classical elements in the forms of pediments or columns or whatever. That's kind of the main game of doing the exterior of a classical building. And he has a bunch of different what goes at it. Annoyingly, none of them are finished, which makes... They would probably have been quite strange to begin with. They're made weirder by being unfinished. I guess maybe Santa Maria Novella is finished, actually, but like most of them are not.
I would controversially say that the facade of the Palazzo Rucellai, that's basically what he intended. Sure, they could have done more of it, but I think that's essentially... those are the two which are essentially finished in his lifetime.
And
that are building scale.
Fittingly, they are both projects for the same patron.
And in fact, he finishes another thing for the same patron as well. So there aren't very many classical precedents for facades, partly because all the facades have been nicked because they were all made of marble.
So you can put them in another building, or you can smash them up and burn them and turn it into cement.
So into cement
Yeah.
to like make your stone wall to keep out the neighbours. In fact, in a jolly good Roman building, you could be there for 50 years ripping out statues and burning them. And the ones that there are like the temple front. It's a bit difficult when you're not building temples.
Yeah, columns with a triangular thing on top.
Columns with a triangular thing on top.
Yeah.
The typology that he's putting these facades onto quite often is the basilica form, the Christian basilica form, which comes out of kind of late Roman, like Constantinian architecture. And you basically have a nave, which is very high, and then 2 aisles on either side, which are not quite as high. Here, the sort of archetypal examples is something like Old St. Peter's, which had that kind of tripartite facade shape. And one of the things that is true throughout all of Alberti's church facades is that he's trying to navigate his way around that problem of how you geometrically resolve that form of a tall middle bit and then 2 shorter side bits.
I mean, in terms of other Roman precedents that you can draw on, the other big one is the Triumphal Arch, which is this sort of great big block of stone, and it normally has a big arch shape in the middle and maybe a little arch shape on either side, and then it has normally attached columns on the facade of some kind, and like and sort of relief sculpture and this kind of stuff on it as well.
If you don't know what they look like, it's a big stone archway that you would have like a gate in a city wall, except they don't have doors, and then there's normally 2 small ones on either side, although there are different shapes.
Their association, and part of the reason that they're so potent in remembering and reviving the significations of classical architecture, is that they are symbols of military triumph, and that they made up processional routes through Rome where triumphant generals returning to Rome after a period of conflict would be able to pass through an archway with all of their loot, all of their booty in a long train, and they'd be able to pass through this archway in a triumphant celebration of their victories.
And one of the key things for us is that they're very thick pieces of stone, normally with lots of concrete in the middle, much, much thicker than you have for everything else, so they're still there. I mean, if he'd been able to go back to ancient Rome, there'd be plenty of precedents, which would have been very exciting for him. But there aren't. There are a few things. I would add to the main obvious ones of Temple and Triumphal Arch, which are scattered all over the place. I would add Colosseum, massive thing in Rome. Aqueduct. If you go around that part of the country, there's aqueducts everywhere. They're like this is like you go through a field and then there's a big chunk of aqueduct. Like if you go along the train lines, you will just see the Romans built loads of them. And there are some other ones as well, like different sorts of temples. Some of the round ones were made of concrete, so it didn't matter that you'd had all the marble nicked. So you could sort of have some strange ideas, but there really wasn't very much else. There are particular buildings. These buildings are very different, as you were alluding to with basilicas, but with all of them, they're very different to the buildings in a medieval city.
Yeah. And so classicism really is about coming up with a way of using all of these Roman ingredients, this kind of storehouse of like Roman stuff, but applying them to a fundamentally different type of building.
If I asked you to build a Gothic airport, you would be having a similar sort of set of problems. There's no example of a Gothic airport, but you would also kind of know where to start.
Yeah, flying buttresses.
Yeah, flying buttresses.
Yeah,
You'd sort of
flying
start...
buttresses. Light coming in very high up.
Yeah.
I guess like the sort of the sort of radial pod chapel could become the little individual departure zones or something.
Yeah. Lots of little vaulted toilet cubicles.
It'd be lovely. Yeah.
The whole thing would be multi-faith prayer centre.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I want to think through with that, though, is that you could do a Gothic airport where you just stuck Gothic detailing on everything, right? And in that idea of sort of the classical language as just a grab box of bits to stick onto a building, that has been going on in Italy through most of this period, like the Romanesque.
And the best way of grabbing a bit of and put your design classical detailing is to literally take one. They're lying all over the place.
Whereas part of Alberti's project is about more, I think, than just
he wants
the
to make
bits.
A real Gothic
airport, or he wants to,
like the Goths would have done it.
There is something beyond just the elements of classicism that Alberti is interested in capturing and reformulating. Some kind of spirit that lies in proportion or harmony or composition that goes beyond just the elements.
I think that's really important, and what characterizes the transformation that he's going through also is that he's kind of working that out. In the book, he says columns are form of ornament, which is something which you could also say, you know, if you go back 2 centuries to all of those churches in Pisa with all those little columns across the facade, you could say, oh yeah, columns as ornament. I mean, in a way, those are the most ornamental columns you can possibly imagine. But he is trying to do something fundamentally different, but he hasn't totally rejected the idea that columns are ornament either. He's sort of in between.
And he hasn't totally rejected all of the architecture that happened after Rome. And I think that's for a similar reason, which is that if you are in Florence in 1450 and you look at the baptistry, you'd have to be an idiot not to think that's high quality architecture, because it conspicuously is.
So what's the order here? What do we talk about first? Do you want to start in Rimini, because it's a sort of big hitter?
I think we can start with Rimini. This is a rather curious building built for a rather extraordinary man.
So Rimini, which is a city on the Adriatic,
it's got a beautiful little centre, and then there's like a mass of hotels with sun lounges and sort of like cheesy discos.
Like heaven. It's the church, I think, is dedicated to St. Francis. It's sort of known to history as the Tempio Malatestiano, after its patron, the redoubtable Sigismondo Malatesta. He's one of the great characters of the era. He was not for nothing was he known as the Wolf of Rimini.
He's good. If he was an energetic fellow.
It's not the kind of nickname people give you if you're well known for being affable and seeking consensus all the time, is it? It's like a...
We were talking that these people weren't necessarily, it wasn't necessarily just like dog eat dog, but I mean, there was certainly a strong element of that.
You came to a sticky end. Well, maybe we'll circle back to that. But and it's a church.
Yeah, so what's the project?
That's a good question, isn't it? The project seems to be the internal reorganization and external overcladding of an existing church dedicated to St. Francis. Alberti does reorganize the inside. He kind of creates this internal structure with these chapels on the inside. And he also overclads the outside, and he partially completes this big marble facade. But somehow entombed in all of that is the original structure of the church, which gives it its very peculiar character and rather daring elevations.
And you have funny moments where because of incomplete elements from Alberti's designs, the original body of the church kind of like pops up and pops out at you.
But even more curious than that, this is something he would have left. If you go along either side, there's this very thick white marble classical facade which is very much like the side of Hawksmoor Church or something like that. White arches processing on, and then there's a gap of about 1.5 feet, and then there's a Gothic church with windows that don't line up at all. Just like, it's completely bizarre.
It's extremely daring. It looks like nothing so much as like a rather successful postmodern building from the 20th century. So the mismatch between them creates these very strange effects. I'm looking at a little procession of 5 different arches. In the second to left one, you can see some little Gothic tracery, which is sort of hard up against the column. You can see that it continues and then emerges into the bay on the other side. Then there's a funny little window and some tiny little windows kind of spaced all over the place. It looks like a collage, actually.
I'm going to make a go at describing what initially the whole project was going to be. Initially, there's this rectangular Gothic church. He's going to build a new wall on 3 sides of that, which is spaced off, very thick, like Roman piers. Feels like an aqueduct or something, but all in beautiful marble. The front's going to have these 3 big arched openings with a pediment on top of some sort. And at the back, there's going to be effectively a whole new church, which is going to be a circle with a huge dome on top. So the old church is going to be this sort of historical lobby full of the great deeds of his ancestors and various works of art. And there's this huge dome at the end, which is going to be the new body of the church. And the old one is wrapped in this hugely thick wall that doesn't do anything. It's literally a classical dressing up.
On the exterior, there's this strongly expressed, like, plinth. I mean, he talks about in the book how it's good to raise things off the ground, that the sacred building kind of is lifted up above everything else. But in fact, then, the entrance into the actually existing church has to sort of puncture through that because the ground level is at actual ground level. At least according to Vitkower's essay, this is Rudolf Vitkower's, like...
Is it Vitkower, not Vitkar? I think you're probably right.
I mean, it's Vitkower, I guess. According to him, the original design for this is you've got these sort of 3 bays across the front with these Corinthian attached columns on the facade. And then the original plan was that in the middle, you've got like a double one. You've got one on top of another. And then what was going to be on the top was a little arch on top. So it would go, rather than a pediment, the top of it would be... like a little sort of curvy top.
There's a medal that someone did, but I also don't entirely believe that depiction. I think there's things on that are clearly not how it would have been.
Because he wasn't on site for the construction of most of this. He had a project architect, Manetto de Pasti, I think. I actually have quite a fun letter here. I got a little quotation from an angry letter from Alberti regarding the dome, specifically to his project architect. So, greetings. Your letters were most welcome in many ways, and welcome in that my lord has done what I wanted, that he has taken the best advice from everyone. But when you tell me that Manetto asserts that the dome should be 2 diameters high, then I prefer to believe those who built the baths and the Pantheon and all those other great things rather than him, and reason more than any person. And if he relies on opinion, I will not be surprised if he is often in the wrong.
Ah, right. So this is if the assistant is trying to change the design of the dome and make it pointier.
This is pretty academic because they didn't even ever start it.
But there you get some sense of this frustration. He's away from the building site. He's directing the construction by letter. He's invoking the authority of classical precedent in favour of his own designs against the project architect who he thinks is doing a naff job of it.
In being away from Rimini, he missed some of the more exciting things that went on there. There was a great moment at content warning, but where Sigismondo, He must have been offended, I suppose, by the Pope's envoy, who was a 15-year-old bishop of the kind that was around at that time. So he tied him up in the main square of Rimini and raped him.
That's the sort of chap he was. His career consists of, he inherited quite a lot of land and successively tried to play everybody off against everybody else with astonishing ferocity. Basically, he'd play off the Venetians, the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, the Milanese, normally always beefing with the Duke of Urbino, who's one of the other great patrons of this period, always depicted in profile because of the massive facial scarring on the other side of his head, and successively alienated everyone. And as soon as a little bit of peace broke out between the people, they basically all nobbled him. But until then, he was able to have all sorts of fun.
He was excommunicated for a whole lot of different things.
Energetic chap. He also had his own mini Renaissance in Rimini. Amazing patron.
I want to say something about the inside of the church, which is not greatly improved by having been blown up by the Americans in the Second World War. The side of it is articulated as this series of big arched openings. And they're kind of triumphal arch kind of openings, I guess, if they come from anywhere. It's like a half-round arch on top of these two big pilaster on either side.
There's only so much you can do, because that's all original Gothic underneath. Yeah. Also, he wasn't in charge of any of the internal decoration, which is done by a quite good sculptor. And there's lots of good marbles there, although most of them were destroyed. Fine, working out what he did with the interior is very difficult, because other people were working on that project in the interior, whereas the facades are by him, probably. This project rather fizzles out, because a long time before Sigismondo meets his end, he stops being able to win any wars and consequently stops being able to make enough money.
Yeah. So that's the thing about being this type of strongman.
And he's a really extreme example. He's like pure condottieri.
Yeah, your works only last your lifetime, don't they? There's no continuity, really.
He was an inherited aristocrat, but he forced himself on by being this man who had an army from his estate and used it against everyone, playing off all sorts of people against each other. For most people, that's much less true. He's a funny character, being halfway like pure mercenary and halfway local aristocrat. It certainly could be that you would rise and fall in a generation, but most didn't. His great rival, the Duke of Urbino, they carried on. They got a good art gallery in Urbino because they carried on for a while.
He's one of the few people to have been canonized into hell.
Oh, how do you do that?
Well, you just, it's a ceremony,
Oh, okay.
They just say, while you're still alive, that you're definitely going.
You're going, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was reading somewhere that his death was celebrated with the burning of an effigy of him, sort of Guy Fawkes style, all over Italy by papal decree. There were effigies of him burnt when he died.
Relatively late on in his life, he was planning to murder the Pope, which is a
big plan.
Rarely attempted.
Oh, I don't know.
Infamy.
They did it a few times. Mind you, there's still people trying to do that now every now and again. I reckon there's a few people. I don't think you'd have to look far for finding people who want to murder the Pope. Probably the less said about that, the better.
Well, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? If you look at the front facade,
I'm pretty certain, by the way, that these were not meant to be blind.
These openings on the front. So there's the three bays. There's a central one, which is an arch with a smaller door inside it. And then there are blind arches on either side of it.
I mean, I think they were just meant to go back to the Gothic. There's two things I want to say about it. One of which is, it's the first building I can think of which has got that now very canonical classical feature of this succession of arched, deep windows on the side, which would be very familiar to people who know English classical churches. It's just like that. I don't know of any example prior to this of that. And that is a big collection of details. And he does various other things that, people do with it. And the other one is this very strong cornice across the front, which sets up a very strong horizontal band, which feels very classical. That feels very Triumphal Arch or Colosseum band, or that's very like a piece of Roman architecture, more like a piece of Roman architecture than most classical architecture. So it's got a bit of the synthesis. You can really see it fizzing here. And the third thing is obviously it's such a weird collage, and it's such a strange maneuver it's so heteroclite in its sort of tastes. Can
I make a point about the way in which it moves on from Brunelleschi's architecture? Because Also in Brunelleschi's architecture, we find columns, we find these sort of parades of half-round arches. But the standard maneuver there is that he has little columns, or rather slender, attractive, and then these kind of very lightly expressed arches with a sort of minimal architrave marching along. And we don't have any of that here. Where we have arches, they meet like square attached pilasters. So like is a column which is flat or which is sort of extruded from the facade and which is expressed as something sort of growing out of the wall or something which is created by a disturbance of the wall. There is a sense in which having like an arch which comes down on top of a sort of freely standing column is a bit of a mismatch between two incompatible things. Really, a column standing on its own ought to have a lintel on top of it. That's sort of how it's meant to be.
I feel like they've got very different ancestries. Yeah. This, to me, feels like it's strongly like an aqueduct or the Colosseum, whereas Brunelleschi feels like it's an inheritor of all these gone, arcades from late antiquity. Like
it's old St. Paul's. It's Constantine's old St. Paul's.
Or Justinian's palace in Ravenna, which you can see in the mosaics, or if you go around, they still have this sort of, some of the very early churches still that, where the church will have that arcade down the long side before you go in with a sort of slanted roof. Brunelleschi feels like he's sort of keying off that, whereas this feels straight, sort of high imperial pomp, massive piers, and they're little pilasters, but in this one, really, the columns are, finished decoration. They're in the same sort of language as egg and dart moulding or like little details, whereas these big piers are real, massive structure marching.
So on the side, they're either piers or they're columns, but they're big square things with a sort of expressed cornice around the top. We don't have any of this thing where an arch comes down on top of a lovely round freestanding column.
Yeah, they're not columns in the sense of they don't belong to an order. They're not round. They're not monolithic or pretending to be monolithic.
They're part of a wall.
They're pieces of wall. There definitely is a wall with, you can tell it's a wall because there's a blooming wall at the bottom. They're just like big windows.
And that's it, isn't it? Really, buildings need walls. Kind of wall architecture is one of the things which classicism has to address itself to. One of the debates in classical architecture over the years, which becomes expressed at certain points as the sort of battle between the Romans and the Greeks, not literally, but in terms of their allegiances, of the sort of relative, like what you should be doing with columns. Yeah. In a Greek architecture, really the architecture is sort of, in theory, all columns, that the columns are holding up the building.
And you should really have one story. Yeah. You shouldn't have giant orders. Like there's one massive order. You can kind of cheat a bit. Like Soane is a classic Greek. He sort of cheats.
You should have columns, and then on top of the columns, it's a trabeated architecture. So you have like flat lintels which sit on top of the columns.
But what you don't have on top of a column is another column.
Whereas in Roman architecture, columns are a lot closer to, although rhetorically they're not decoration. They're not like ornament. But in practice, they're a lot closer to being ornament than they are to being the sort of generative structural element.
Insofar as if you read the curving facade of the exterior of the Colosseum or the Theatre of Marcellus, then the three orders of columns, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, that go up the exterior, or is it 5 in the case of the Colosseum? Regardless, those columns are not holding up the structure of the Colosseum in any meaningful sense. The structure of the Colosseum is the thousands of tons of brick arches and concrete that all build up.
Massive stones. I love those massive stones. They're so big.
That's it. Yeah, in Greek architecture, the columns hold things up literally. And in Roman architecture, they hold them up symbolically.
Yeah, and sometimes literally, but...
And this is the freeness of the Roman architecture that makes Alberti so clearly a Roman, not least because he never went to Greece. In the case of the Pantheon in Rome, you've got big concrete dome, enormous thick brick piers holding up the structure in a drummed shape, and then chucked on the front, you have what are proper Greek columns, insofar as the portico is supported by the columns, but just chalked on the front.
I mean, it's all slightly, in terms of the debate, a little irrelevant because the West didn't really rediscover Greek architecture until like the late 17th century, whereas Roman architecture was all around. There are multiple precedents for these Alberti buildings, but they are all Northern Italian, and in a way, Brunelleschi's are too. I disagree. Like, there is a notion in architecture history that Brunelleschi's idea of having an arch and a column is novel, is deeply novel. But actually, there are things like that in antiquity. They're just different. And I just think he's working with a different set of references. As we were talking, you know, these like late antiquity, smaller column buildings, you know, you have in the sort of Christian period, basically.
And as we've mentioned, Alberti's decrying the destruction of good buildings that's going on while he's around, and he is working with a reference-based. He can go and see things in the flesh that we can't now go and see in the flesh because they existed then and they don't exist now.
Look at the lovely plaster they made with them.
So, should we do a different building?
Yeah, should we go on? So, do you want to say anything about the tower in Ferrara?
So there is a tower in Ferrara, which is on the corner of the cathedral. Ferrara is a beautiful city. Rimini is beautiful. These are all beautiful cities.
Ferrara is a lovely sort of red brick student town, very lively.
They do flag waving and bugling. Yeah, it's very impressive. The bugling,
very
it's better
strong
than it sounds. Oh yeah, I went there and I asked. There was a student bar and it had daiquiri on the menu, or like painted up on the wall, and I said, I'll have a daiquiri, and they said, just a daiquiri? And I said, yes, and they gave me a plastic cup full of gin. That was good, I had that.
Felt much better. Yeah.
The cathedral's amazing. It's got this incredibly long like set of arcades down one side, which is full of like kiosks, and then at the end there's this strange Renaissance tower in its sort of white and pink banding.
So they would have been building this for the last 250 years or something, and this is the
cathedral. I should think they started probably when the good times started. Like they started in 1130. It's very plausible this is not by Alberti. Let's put it like that. It is an interesting classical synthesis. It's got a strong bit of like campanile about it. It's got his very strong cornice banding, which is a sort of very Albertian thing. It's early in terms of this sort of classical language. It's got real columns, which would be interesting for Alberti because he doesn't really... I mean, they're made of little stones, and it's got fine classical detailing. Yeah. And it's got some slightly curious... The way it finishes is slightly curious.
It doesn't look totally done. There's something interesting about the proportions as well, because it looks as if it's made of 4 cubes on top of each other geometrically.
Yeah, all the columns are the same proportions. The columns on each story are the same proportions and the same detailing of the capitals on the top as well. It's
got some very Albertian qualities to it. It's got a really obsessive, stark proportion. One of the things that's fun about using proportional systems is they make you do the thing which is kind of extreme. You have this extreme cut crispness that feels like that's not a chance.
It also has these things bridging back into a slightly earlier period in history, like the stripy coloured masonry, which is a sort of toothpaste pink and white.
Yeah, most of the stuff is green and white, but there is lots of pink all over as well. That's the third colour, which is lovely. They've got such good buildings around this bit of the world. It's not really fair.
Yeah, so not so much to say about that. So I would rather go into Florence. Let's talk about Florence and let's talk about Mantua, because those are the two big locations of the other work. So in Florence, there is a palace, a church, and a tiny little sort of shrine tomb. And in Mantua, there are 2 churches, which are sort of the late work, aren't they?
Yeah, the smaller of the 2 churches is going on at the same time as some of the Florence stuff. Yeah. The main one is like mainly done after he died, like really mainly.
The things in Florence are the most finished, and I think we'll probably also want to talk about the churches as a kind of lineage or continuity as well. Yeah. So maybe we should go into that. Should we talk about Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which is church It gives its name to the main railway station.
Yeah, I mean, well, the railway station, you come out of the railway station and you look at the back of the church. And it's a huge church complex, actually, belonging sort of twinned the Dominicans and the Medicis, kind of.
And again, it's an existing church where his intervention is the facade.
Yeah, and I mean, just a bit of it. It's a huge complex. It's quite a small but very notable contribution.
Yeah, and the facade actually, so it's just the front facade, and the facade also was underway. Or there was existing like marble work which had been done to it, which he retained and incorporated into the design.
These buildings, they're such big projects, these complexes, that someone would basically pay for and get a little bit of something done, unless you had a really powerful patron with tons of money. And there aren't very many of them around because these are small states. Stuff would take ages just because, like most of the time, nothing would be happening. So. You know, they built this body of the church and done the inside, and then 50 years later, a man left some money in his will, and they'd spent that on getting the marble up to a certain level, and then left it for another 80 years. And then Alberti's friend comes in to makes loads and loads of money and gives him some jobs, and this is one of the key ones.
Matt was mentioning earlier that one of the problems that you're taking on when you're doing a facade like this in the classical style is that it's a rather awkward shape. So there's a bit in the middle. All of these churches, they want to go very high. The middle bit is higher. The two bits on the side, which are somewhat lower and which structurally serve the function of stopping it from falling down, and which also create kind of space for circulation and chapels and things like that. And somehow those things have to be unified, although they're this rather awkward like heap shape. Well, I guess one of the things which is revolutionary about this building is that it does unify it in a quite compelling way through the use of geometrical proportion.
Talk a little bit about what precedents he would have before this for doing it, which is that the facade was like the last thing that people would do with these churches. So hardly any of them got done in the Gothic period. There are a couple, like Orvieto is a famous example. And they are kind of plainer, more geometric, and more interested in beautiful low bas relief and coloured marble than they would be in other countries, but they're essentially Gothic.
I guess in rich cities they did finish them, didn't they? Because that's why they're all finished in like Pisa and Lucca and those places.
Well, they were doing them earlier as well, so I think they also had a 150-year head start. Like Pisa's, its history is kind of earlier. And they don't put all that effort into making beautiful paintings in Pisa in quite the same way. They're sort of so into this stunning marble work.
And then in France and other places.
In France, the facade, and in England is more important. Also, the Gothic starts later in Italy. So the Romanesque ones are often finished. But the Gothic is kind of a period... The Gothic in Italy... You'd have to start right at the beginning of the Gothic for it not to be out of fashion by the time you're doing the facade. There are quite a few Romanesque facades. We'll talk, I'm sure, about Santa Maria del Monte, which is one of the monasteries on the outskirts of Florence.
San Miniato
del Monte, of the hill.
Of the juice.
Of the juice. Those are sort of another thing he could go on, which in the local tradition are beautiful patterns of cut green and white marble. Very flat. Very little relief in the facades, and very little... The decoration is very geometric. It kind of has nods towards classical detailing, potentially, but it's very geometric and abstract. And what else would he have to go on? The other things he would have to go on is classical antiquity. And it is a synthesis of these elements which is going to produce the facade.
Can I talk a bit about the composition? It's this big facade, and the way it's composed is rather interesting. One thing about it is it's very flat. I mean, I guess it is a facade, but even for a facade, it's quite flat.
Yes, but less flat than the Romanesque ones. Than the Romanesque white and green ones that were in Florence.
You've got this sort of shape which is quite wide, but then is higher in the middle. And the way in which he kind of reconciles this in a classical way is that you have this strongly expressed sort of horizontal band going across the middle, which is this sort of cornice band that we talked about already, and then there's a little bit sitting on top of that. And then sitting on top of it, there's something like a little temple. So you've got a big cornice at the top with this rather wonderful big like roundel with the sun in it. And then that's supported by 4 columns, which are slightly unevenly spaced because they have to accommodate this big round existing window, which is in the middle. And then that's sitting on this wider band, which is sort of like a sort of platform. And then supporting that, there's again a series of columns on the facade. And in between all of those again are also slightly unevenly spaced. They're wider on either side and narrower in the middle. In between all of that, there's a whole lot of sort of pre-existing but incorporated Gothic stone detailing with these sort of niches and tombs and things like that. And then there's an awkward bit which you've got to cover up. You've got to cross over between the corners because there are these bits of roof which would otherwise be poking up on either side of the temple on the top. And what he comes up with to conceal those and to sort of bridge between them is these great big scrolls. Again, have like a big, strongly expressed circular thing, and then they have this sort of scrolly.
They're kind of like really cool bookends, holding it up. Like you've got an ionic column and you just unrolled it. What would be the volute? It's sort of just rolled out.
And the way in which the marble, this like marble ornamentation is quite precious. There's lots of very fine work, and the whole thing, although it's very classical in some ways, sort of has a material feeling of a slightly earlier era, doesn't it? It feels like a much more of a medieval.
The medium is Tuscan Romanesque, straight up and down, and this is a medium of green and white marble, and occasionally pink, as we saw in Ferrara. And when you say a column is coming down, you mean a column is drawn on. This is a brick wall, which is a flat brick wall with sort of a keying, which allows you to attach a thin fascia of marble to it in these 2 colours.
Aside from the materiality, the thing that separates it from the Romanesque facade treatment is, and you get a sense of it when you're looking at images of it, but even more of a sense when you see the drawn out proportional plans of the forms. I'll post one of these pictures on the Instagram. The whole thing fits together as, for example, where those volute scrolls are on either side of the little temple, you can perfectly split that level into 4 squares of equal, and it will fall the middle of the 2 sets of squares will fall right in the middle of the rose window. Yeah, it all geometrically works out.
And the whole thing is, the bottom, the thing is as wide as it's tall. Bottom band is 2 squares. The top band is 1 of the same square. Sun is half the size of the window, and it's the harmonic between them for the size of the rows of the roundel, and blah, 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 golden section, arch, square, circle.
That creates, this sort of unity, slightly undone by these strange like Gothic accretions at the bottom, which also give it a lot of its charm. It has the slight clashing between the elements gives it some of its weirder moments. There's a great little moment at either side where you have this big stripy square pilaster, and then you have a round green marble column, Corinthian column, which is the same height but much thinner, which is just attached next to it. And then you have a tiny little attached column, which is part of a sort of slightly recessive, much smaller order of little arches, which are just expressed as a pure kind of flat decoration. And you get all the 3 of them together, and they're 3 different columns of completely different sizes and different types, all right on top of each other, like some kind of pile-up.
There's so many ways you can analyse it. In some ways, it's more harmonious than the Romanesque facades that he's sort of strongly influenced by, but in others it's much less. He's kind of trying to do 2 things to make this more ideal sort of facade. One of which is he's tried to smooth that out to make it into perfect harmonic relationships, squares and circles and things, onto a facade that wasn't like that originally. And the other one, he's trying to introduce clearer classical language. So the columns look more like Roman columns. There's a pediment on the top, which is very clearly a pediment. In Rimini, it looks like it kind of could be something that's taken out of a Roman building. This doesn't look like this. It looks like a drawing of a Roman one, but it's got Roman detailing.
It sort of looks like he's drawn it and someone else has obsessively coloured it in or something. In Rimini, because of the materiality, it sort of looks like, wow, this could be a Roman ruin or something. Maybe if you didn't know very much about it, you could believe that it was. Or maybe as really happened, that someone had built a medieval church inside a previous Roman structure, which happens quite a lot. But in this one, there's no mistaking. It's definitely a medieval kind of materiality, which has just been applied to this new schema.
And he has achieved that. It does seem convincingly like there are moments of synthesis where Roman architecture is being put, sort of managing to be synthesized with Romanesque architecture. But to achieve that harmony, there's lots of really gawky, weird moments, like this band across the middle, which is kind of like a jumbo expanded like cornice of some sort, decorative like frieze level. It's awkward.
It's lacking something to put there, isn't it?
They don't have them in the Romanesque buildings, and they look better because they don't have them.
It needs something. It's got this very unconvincing series of little like square stampers all the way across
those
it.
things just don't exist. That's just like normally like just a band. The next thing's on, you know.
But isn't what he's done there to fill the space is he's like unravelled and straightened out and flattened the like a line of coffers from like a barrel arch almost, or like something like that.
And it's a synthesis, but it's awkward. The whole thing feels, it's like these, he's done these geometric, this like topological transformations of like, you know, you fed Romanesque and Roman into the machine and told it everything's got to be in perfect squares. And it's produced this complete synthesis. It's a success, but it's also...
It has moments where
it's awkward and weird.
The simulation is thinner in some places. That's definitely one of them. I think it needs a relief. It needs like an elephant battle or something.
It would be good if you could put a big frieze, a big like Hellenistic high deep relief frieze across that band would do bits here, I think.
What I would do is have some strange moments of asymmetry, which is what the Romanesque, they would put like a giant duck on one side. Like there's things that are so strange. You're like, what? You've just put a duck in that one. One of the white squares has got a duck in it, and all of the other ones are just circles.
It's St. Albans duck. You know.
The other thing it's got, which is very un-Romanesque, is that, I mean, the Romanesque would have fine detail in the inlay, but here there is just tons of fiddly laceworky detail, which is very sort of stunning on its own and very crafty, and is a good thing of its own, but it means that it's sort of busy.
Should we say a little about the man that paid for this, or do we
yeah,
have
sure.
more
Do you
want
want
to
to say
about
something?
it?
So these are all projects of the Rucellai dynasty, are they?
Yes.
Well, one Rucellai.
Giovanni, who was leading figure within the wool guild in Florence in this period. The wool guild being one of the most powerful because, like many,
That was the business.
Yeah, that was the business. That was where you got the money.
In like England, there are two businesses: wool and fighting the French, and war. And in Italy, there are three: war, wool, and banking.
There's a fun little bit of backstory about Rucellai getting involved with the funding of this, or the way he sort of finagled to get maximum benefit out of funding the building of this facade. It's a little bit dense. I was reading an academic article about it, but basically he managed to convince the monastery of Santa Maria Novella to let him use a load of their pastoral meadows for his sheep so that they could get fatter and make more wool so that he could make more money. And he said, you know, I'm gonna sort out your facade. I'm gonna pay for your facade, and my man Alberti's gonna sort it. But also, you know, wants a little bit of a pushback.
That's kind of nice. The other thing with him is he, along with the Alberti family, are political allies and just a rung below the Medici. I mean, the Alberti are now 2 rungs below the Medici, but they used to be kind of 1, and they are squarely in the Medici faction.
So should we talk about the Palazzo?
He's not a violent psychopath. He didn't like gouge people's eyes out personally or anything.
No. Respectable man. Get someone else to do it for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So if you're a big, powerful rich aristocratic family functioning within a city republic like Florence, what do you need? You need a palazzo.
You need a palazzo,
You
yeah.
need a nice, big, beautiful mansion in the middle of town.
These buildings have been around for a while, and they are a big, sort of semi-fortifiable building in town, which you have your business, you live in it. All the people who work in your business probably live in it, or most of them. Like, it's like a compound. And classically, they are as much of a city block as you can assemble, tall, not many windows on the ground floor, big door, courtyard. Ones of a few generations before have been pretty plain, speaking more to their sort of fortified origins. Oh, and they always have a bench around the base. You can always have a little...
Well, so that your clients can come and sit and show to the town how important you are and how many people are supping from your coffers.
But the generation before this one is built, people had started to decorate the outside more. And those are normally in the form of sort of banding and rustication.
And occasional little Gothic arch mouldings on the windows, on the piano nobile, maybe.
Lots of places to put flags out and things, or shields.
But this is different. This is a complete facade treatment. And it is, so correct me if I'm wrong, this again is an existing building to which he's applying...
It's slightly more complex than that. The Ritual have just assembled the site, managing to buy out various buildings, and they are kind of keeping quite a lot of them. They've basically bought up the whole city block. They're knocking bits out of it and kind of making the palazzo on the inside out of it. So work's being done to, and this is like the skin to make it into one building.
Right, okay, so it's sort of knitting together a series of existing spaces and fragments.
Some of which are being rebuilt behind as well. But yeah, it's certainly it's just a facade project.
And, well, what can you say about it?
So I would like to first say the presidents immediately before this have established that you have different levels. You've got a ground level, which is often, you've got your bench, the ground level, which is often very tough, from the sort of old ones where that's like repelling the Frasers coming, with all their, who want to come and burn you down. And then it gets finer as it goes up, and the people and the family live on the first floor. English first floor, as in the one that's not the ground floor. Here, he's done something which has not been done before, which is the whole facade is square cut stone, and it's all decorative. It's in 3 bands. There's actually another story above, which actually looks quite nice.
Where the servants live.
This is a sort of Attica story, yeah. The bottom band is the tallest. It's got a big bench, which is kind of made of like these diagonally cut, square cut stone. Sort of in imitation of that, although it's a bit bigger than the Roman stuff, which is where they have these like long square bricks, but set them at 45 degrees. There are 3 big bands, each with these big cornices. It's divided the other way into a grid by columns, pilasters, which are all drawn on. None of this is structural. Again, it's a brick wall behind. We're seeing, for the first time that I know it since antiquity, your Doric, Ionic, Corinthian orders, one on top of each other, getting, as they're meant to.
Yeah, but Doric is like the strong, rough order.
And that's the level where the business and defence is going on.
And Corinthian is the fine, decorative order, yeah.
So you've got this grid. The strongest is the horizontal, and the vertical pilasters. Between the pilasters are a sort of window, which is one where it's rectangular proportioned with an arch top, and where the lights themselves, the windows there are 2 divided with little arches and a column down the middle, which is the style which had been going in Italy for a while before. It's the sort of like now established for 100 years style.
Yes. And isn't...
Not at all Roman.
No, not at all Roman. And actually, in all of its precedents, pretty Gothic. It's a Gothic motif that is here being incorporated into...
Yeah, well, it's got a round arch, though. And he has put in this little break as well, that the window doesn't go up and become the arch, but is broken by this little completely redundant, like lintel that goes across.
It's worth saying, just to spell it out explicitly, that this like Doric, Ionic, Corinthian flat facade is the Colosseum model, the Theatre of Marcellus model. But instead of going round like the outside of a an amphitheatre. Here it is flattened, quite seriously flattened, and expressed not just straight but also with a lack of depth.
I mean, this is, again, it's a brick wall, and the depth of the facade is just a maximum of sort of how thick, varying the thickness of the stone. The other thing about it, which is very obvious on the whole thing, is that it's got a curious form of rustication, which is like stone dressing, which I don't know before, where the stones are completely flat, but the joints between them are very exaggerated.
They're like chamfered
in.
I have a little pet theory about this, which I have no idea about its real credibility or anything, but I've always thought that particularly on the ground floor, the rustication treatment, the way that stonework is expressed, looks a lot like first style Roman wall painting, where you paint sort of colourful, fancy marbles. Here, obviously, all expressed in the stone, but the patterns are so distinctly reminiscent of some of the first style wall painting that would have been uncovered in the 15th century on the Capitoline Hill or the Palatine Hill. I don't know. That's a pet theory.
May well
of mine.
be. I think that there's also there's something useful about this treatment, which is that, like, vertically it's broken in an irregular way. It's a great little wheeze. It's a bit like doing those barcode facades, which everyone was really into in the noughties. But it allows you to reconcile all sorts of awkward geometries, because you can sort of just break it up in different ways and work out something that
especially if you're playing his game of trying to make order out of a non-ordered facade. Although here he's managed to do all of the openings. There's a handy thing with these Italian buildings that a lot of the structure often is actually going into the building rather than across the front wall. So you've often got these strong masonry walls going back, acting like racking walls, which means you can play around a lot more with the facade, which is quite nice. What do you think that is all about? What do you think it means? Because it's the first time that someone's done this. It's innovative. It's all drawn over, which is something that no one's done before. He's doing the same tricks again, where he's managed to create a very strong, here much more like complete order on the facade. Now, it's just one material, which brings it down to a state of order. And then it's a perfect grid, just one grid. And it's flat, but it is drawn all over with this chamfering, which has meant that it really sticks out. It's in a very tight little corner of the city, this. It's got a little triangle of ground in front of it, but it's very small. The triangle of ground is much smaller than its high, but it immediately sticks out. If you see a little bit of it down the street, it's got this very strong graphic compared to most of these buildings are rendered, basically, made of stones or brick with stone on the sort of dressings and details and things. So it's got this black, white shadow striking all in one order, and the colour is an austere brown, which is sort of businesslike and responsible. And it does seem like it's very established, when actually it's a pretty nouveau riche bunch of people. And if you want to communicate this message of strength, stability in a noble family, I think it's a great achievement at that. And also it makes, in that funny little triangle, there's another thing which the loggia, which may be by him or like instructed or built at around the same time, a little bit later, which also makes this little play of an open space. Again, you're talking about patrons coming to visit. And in the book, he was talking about how you should have a little loggia so that the youths can exercise while their dads are off.
So this is in the inside, off the courtyard?
No, this
outside. Is outside. This is across the street.
On the street, across the... It's now like being glazed in.
On the other side of the street.
It's like at 45 degrees to the facade. 90 degrees to the facade. So if you're facing it, it's to your right.
It's the same kind of setup as the Palazzo Vecchio or the Palazzo di Signori, as it would have been at this point, where you have the sort of sculpture displaying loggia off to the left-hand side. And it does, you're right, it creates this complex, diaphanous spatial experience whereby you have the open area of the street, you have the closed area of the palazzo, and then you have the loggia, which is kind of semi-permeable. You can go on into it at some times, but at other times maybe the, Rucellai servants will mercenaries will block it off for certain functions, and
yeah, they have weddings in there and stuff.
it communicates the relationship to the city in a really interesting way.
It's this really tight corner, and the effect of this austere graphic facade and this little open, now glazed in Bang & Olufsen shop loggia, which they shouldn't have done that. That was an error.
It's not quite as pathetic as the noodle shop in Quinlan Terry basement, but
what you don't get from the pictures is how small the square is, and how these two forms, they do make a public place, and it does feel like this is a very established bunch of people. And it works very well like that. And it's very influential. That one's one of his more influential projects, I'd say.
So he does one more for the Rucellai, which is this, a sepulchre.
Well, the reason it's called a sepulchre is because it's
modelled on the one of Christ, isn't it?
This is it's a very striking thing when you go and see it. It's very small.
So it's inside the existing church of San Pancrazio.
Yeah, and in fact, it's inside a little side chapel.
Actually, now, if you want to go and see it, it's sort of contained within this museum to a sculptor called Marino Marini, who is a not super interesting 20th century sculptor. But anyway, you've got to pay the ticket if you want to go and see that.
Lots of people have become interested in his work since that's been the only way to see this thing.
It's really, really tiny. It must be, 3 meters tall?
When you see a photograph of it, it seems like it must be reasonably big because there's a door. But the door is half the height of a normal door.
Yeah, it's a sort of kneeling door. And inside it has a tiny little room and a tiny little altar.
And the body of Giovanni Rucellai. This is him doing geometry to its absolute limits. It's like a golden rectangle in plan, divided by various golden rectangle harmonics, and with squares, again in this green and white marble. And it's got a semicircular arch bay on the back, again decorated in squares of white and green marble. Each of these has a sort of symbolic roundel on it, which are either strange, cryptic, geometric ones, or I think on each side there's personal crest of himself and 3 of the prominent Medicis, but which are sort of incorporated as cryptic symbols as well. And it has a very beautifully done, drawn on pilasters with gorgeous little relief Corinthian capitals, which are all of the cutting is perfect. And then it has a band of writing.
I think they're Ionic, actually, but there you go.
I think they're composite.
That sounds likely. They've got acanthus on them. And there's a band around the top which has got some little poem written on it in really lovely, very fine Roman lettering.
Yeah, Trajanic font.
And then above that, there's a almost like a sort of Venetian building or something. There's a comb of lily, very fine lily marble kind of railing,
but a scale which looks like it's from a much bigger building.
Yeah, it doesn't quite. It reminds me of English Jacobean strap fretwork that you'd get on the top of a Jacobean country house.
Which was riffing very strongly off books of Italian pattern books, right?
It also has, not to be missed, a tiny little tower.
Yeah, a little lantern tower.
It has a little lantern tower with something of a scale that you could put your arms around, and has a tiny little marble cross on the top with a slightly pointed dome.
And I think there's a little window underneath it which lets light into the interior.
It has an unearthly sort of meeting of incompatible scales. The columns are toy columns, but this kind of lily screen at the top looks like sort of architectural salvage from a larger building. So you have this strange thing where you can reach up and touch something which seems like it's been taken off the top of the Doge's palace or something, it's very peculiar. And then the other thing is that it's covered in these wonderfully enigmatic magical symbols.
Well, I mean, he said how you do it. He said how you do a tomb. Tomb's got to be a golden rectangle with a round thing on the back, and it's best if it's to be covered in writing that it be covered in symbols like the Egyptians, because those symbols will be like inscrutable and mystical through all time, rather than language, which will fail.
Language will fail, but symbols are forever.
Except we can't make head or tail of them.
And actually, it's got beautiful writing on it. The writing is really high grade.
It has some nice wall painting on the inside. Well, it's quite dark in there.
It's a jewellery box. It's a lovely little thing.
For keeping your Masonic Lodge things in. It's so... If you wanted architecture, not architecture, mystic magic, it has a real presence.
Yeah, definitely.
It's very cool. It's one of the coolest tombs. Compared to all the other tombs that people were doing at this time, the tombs are very formulaic. They're like a coffin with a big, they go in an arch. This one is pure architecture. It doesn't have much sculpture.
In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there is a little tiny building inside a big building, isn't there? That's also a thing which they're replicating here. Christ's tomb is like a tiny little building inside a big rotunda, originally. It's an edicule, isn't it?
Edicule is a round thing set within another thing, round like Tolos temple with columns. Or it could be square, I think.
I thought an edicule is a little house inside a big house. Sometimes it's like a niche or a...
I think of an edicule as being like a pair of columns with a small pediment that might frame a doorway, or it might frame a niche for a sculpture, or you might get a succession of them sort of stuck together. In Latin, it originally signifies like a small shrine. So like the shrine to the Penates in the family home, which would usually take the form of a little temple, that would be an example of an edicule. So yeah, it's like a small... You're both kind of right. It is like a smaller scale architectural form. Replicating or kind of signifying a bigger one at a smaller scale, be that a niche on a facade or a little structure inside a bigger structure.
It's a very interesting one, this, because it's unlike Italian tombs. It's a novel one. They're normally not freestanding structures, but built into arches and walls, typically on the inside of churches or inside chapels, as this one is. But typically, we saw with Michelangelo building them, but also the ones taken out of the church in Rimini to go onto the back. They're these big, but they're not little boxes, and they don't normally have this way of getting in and out either. It doesn't normally have an interior space that you visit. That feels a bit more like a Roman elite tomb, which I think is another reference that he's pretending, because there are all these strange sort of like kind of quasi-Baroque Roman tombs as you come out of Rome, and not just there as well, in interesting shapes, and at least the concrete cores of them survive.
Things like the baker's tomb.
Yes, but there are also ones which are much more this sort of shape, or cylinders with... They're becoming kind of fancy, complicated forms, and in the kind of like Severn period, I think you get sort of stranger shapes and things. Like that's a classical thing he's bringing in, but they're not as stark and beautiful as this, although they may have been before they had all the marble nicked off.
I think the one in Jerusalem is a reference, though, which is sort of classic topos of modesty, isn't it, to bury yourself in an imitation of Christ's tomb. We've been talking for ages. Should we go on to Mantua? There are two churches in Mantua by Alberti, or allegedly by...
Well, I would say he's definitely involved in speccing them both.
He's dead by the time that one of them is built.
Yeah, the main one, it happens after he's dead, almost in its entirety. The other one, it was certainly there for the beginning.
Should we name the two,
so
just to be clear?
They are respectively San Sebastiano and Sant Andrea, yeah. Sant Andrea is much more finished. San Sebastiano is quite peculiar. Maybe we should talk about San Sebastiano first, because it's in a very partial and strange state, subject to various sort of depredations through history, I suspect.
I think also it was going to be quite blank compared to, but not in the way that it is now. It's a new build.
Yeah.
First thing to say. It's kind of much further out. As you come into Mantua, you go past it. or at least we did. It's a sort of square plan little church. The facade is, I think, the thing that we'll be talking about. Well, it's got central plan things, but I don't think the interior is very interesting, and I haven't been in, so I don't know. It's a white, mainly rendered, I think now, facade, rectangular.
It's a pediment on the top, but it's broken at the bottom, in the middle.
And it's a strikingly broken pediment. We discussed with Venturi breaking pediments is funny, and here he's got a semicircle as well over the break. So that's a strange manoeuvre. And then the bottom, as it currently is very strange. So there's the one window that's breaking the pediment, and then there's a lot of nothing, and then there are 5 openings across the front. The outer 2 I've got arches, and the outer 2 also now have staircases, although they're not original going up to them. And then below that, there was originally another band of 5 arches. And the church has got a sort of ground level crypt, and then the whole body of the church is raised up on the first floor. And it's very stark and weird. The side stairs were added in the late 19th century.
Certainly Vitkova's theory is that there was meant to be a central staircase, which was never built.
Yeah, possibly across the entire facade.
Yeah, it's kind of possible. He does have a speculative reconstruction of what it was meant to look like, which is the sort of pilasters on the front, which are they're not very strongly expressed at the moment, were meant to be much more of a structuring thing, so that they would kind of, the front would be broken up by 6 pilasters, which would be supporting the pediment, and then each of those, they would be in between each of those 5 existing openings, and then there would probably be a great big staircase that would reach all the way across. It would sort of make sense in some way.
Yeah, now it's one of these ones that looks cool, because the facade looks cool because it's weird. It looks like formalist and strange, uncanny. The reconstruction seems very plausible.
It would again have had one of these strangely overexpressed horizontal elements.
Yeah, he loves these.
There's a sort
sometimes they work very well in some buildings and others.
There's a sort of cornice on top of the pilasters, and then there is a gap between that and the pediment. So there's again this sort of strange blankness and over emphasis.
Something I think that's very successful about this project is the broken pediment, which looks cool and feels very daring.
It has quite a powerful effect.
Photographs well.
Yes, so we've got some interesting old photos, which I'll try and make sure end up on the Insta.
I have seen it. I didn't go in. It wasn't quite as cool as it is in the photographs, but it did look very striking.
So Sant Andrea is a larger and much more complete church, and it has an interesting facade, and it also has an interior that's really worth talking about. The facade, as before, there's a sort of a mismatch. There's a bit behind which he's attaching a sort of facade, a kind of entrance portico onto, and for whatever reason, the bit which he attaches on is just several sizes too small for the building behind it vertically.
Yeah, I mean, if you imagine the building behind as being 5 bays wide, it's 3.
Yeah, and it's also not tall enough. So although actually, as is pointed out, you can't really see this from ground level, but there's actually a bit of the building behind it which is poking up and which has a little rose window which is opening up above pediment of the actual building.
And one side is hidden by a bell tower, which I think was built surprisingly. I think that might have been built in the 19th century.
So can I say something about the composition of this facade? So across, it's sort of divided into 4. The 2 middle bays are one big bay with a great big double height sort of arched opening, which is a classic sort of triumphal arch proportioned opening. And then the 2 side bays are created by these great big, they're sort of colossal pilasters, which are Corinthian. Again, a very, very flat, minimally expressed. And in each of those, there are 3 levels. There's a sort of opening door, there's a niche, and then there's a window above it. So that's broken down into 3. And then within the central bay, there's a sort of an arch, which itself is actually resting on a smaller pilaster, which is, if anything, even flatter than the big ones. And then the whole thing is supporting a sort of quite relatively sort of flat pediment. And the whole thing is clearly riffing off the Triumphal Arch as a type, as a precedent. This the sort of the form of this huge, very, very tall, I guess it's twice as tall as it is wide.
Yeah, and also deep. Like the facade has to have a depth to it to enable that triumphal arch in the middle. The main doorway that is set against the wall at the end of that arch is a good 10 foot, 12 foot. The two doorways that are then at the front of the facade to the left and the right, creates this funny space.
There is a place inside the arch. It gets wider. This isn't a facade which is stuck onto a brick wall. This is an extension to the church forward. Again, we had this with Michelangelo. He was thinking about doing this, which allows for him to have some fun. He gets a coffered barrel vault at the top of the arch. And there's a little space, sort of lobby space behind the arch. The arch isn't, the walls of it I don't think go all the way back. It kind of opens out on the sides.
Yeah, so it creates that depth.
It's like a porch for the church, but in a kind of monumental scale. And it is very clearly, as you say, a triumphal arch, but one with some curious characteristics. It's too tall.
It's too tall, but then also it's missing a bit off the top. So in a triumphal arch, you should have another kind of story on top of this. This is the sort of bottom story of a triumphal arch, but with then a kind of temple top.
They tend
which
to
has been
be
stuck
rectangular because they tend to have a chariot on top, but the chariots tend to be made of bronze, so they tend to get
turned into cannons later.
this, and they tend to have pediments, but they're often drawn on basically, and that makes it a bit more temple-y because it's got that facade where it's got a pediment, and then the 4 columns coming down, but they're pilasters, they're attached.
And just to say that although it has this depth within its plan, the ornament is still very flat. It is still have this kind of drawn on quality.
Yes, although it does have a little bit of low relief.
It should be said that the sort of central motif of the facade, which is these 2 giant order Corinthian pilasters standing on either side, right next to a central arch, which is supported on smaller, normal order Corinthian pilasters, which are about half the height of the giant order pilasters, becomes like a serious motif. Often at a much smaller scale, but it's all over the place in Palladio. It becomes something that is seriously picked up very frequently as a sort of treatment of walls and various other things.
Should we say something about the inside? So on the interior, as you go in, there's a sort of barrel vault which basically runs the whole length of the church.
Which is flat and painted garishly. Painted on garish coffers, sorry.
As in Rimini, you have these side chapels which are these big half-round arched openings on the sides, which are kind of like a duplication of the motif and also the sort of geometry which we've had on the front. This kind of front portico.
And at a similar scale.
Yeah, I think more or less the same. Yeah, it's basically the same scale. I mean, actually, it's almost as if that sort of square bit below the pediment on the front is sort of as if that's been taken and then cloned all the way down the 2 sides of the church.
Sort of. And now that I've looked at it like in plans and drawings, I see that. But when I was there,
you don't pick up on it.
It wasn't the feeling I had, because actually the treatment of the inside is very different. The inside was done later and not quite according to specification, and there are differences. So the inside is like really thick pier, arched little side chapel, really thick pier. And the front is like, the arch side chapel is the way in. But those piers are completely flat. They've got painted on decoration. And the feeling and also the light is completely different. The relief when you're outside, the small bits of relief pick up because of the high sun. And the depth is very powerful of this arch because of the shade. Whereas on the inside, it's very big and it feels a bit like a lot of duff Baroque Italian churches a little bit, but it's sort of stranger and has got a sharper proportion.
The thing that it makes me think of, and I think Alberti's clearly thinking about himself as a classical referent for this, particularly in the treatment of the nave, is the Basilica of Maxentius, or the Basilica Nova in Rome, just on the edge of the Forum, where you have this very similar, he's at least trying to create the effect of this, which is where you have very chunky piers supporting barrel vaults at a perpendicular to the main hall, the main nave, and that the very solid, massive piers are holding up with giant order pilasters holding up this enormous barrel vault over the top. It seems to me quite clearly to be calling on...
The scale is like that. He wasn't there for doing the inside, and it doesn't have this stark toughness and strange sort of... The proportions are kind of there, but they're slightly muted by the painting, and which isn't too bad. I mean, but it's painted in. It just doesn't feel quite as exciting as I think it would have been if he'd been there. Which is a shame because there are no Alberti interiors. He does facades, or that's what's been passed down to us, like the proportional schemes of facades. That would bring me on to, like, what is Alberti as an architect? He's a strange sort of beast. He doesn't supervise the construction of buildings. He writes long letters. We have essentially no surviving drawings. In his book, he does talk about making models, and I believe he would have done that because he does the other things he says to do in books. He designs facades. It's like the opposite of what's valorized, isn't it? Yeah. You're meant to be like down there with the stuff, making sure it's happening, and you're not meant to do facadism.
It's meant to be all about space.
And he has an interesting plan a bit.
And it sets him apart from a lot of the other big boys.
Yeah, like
of the Italian
Brunelleschi,
Renaissance.
Very interested in space.
Yeah, and craftsmen as well. Like, Brunelleschi is a goldsmith, Michelangelo's a sculptor, most of his contemporaries...
They're all sculptors, basically. Like,
are like training in the kind of artisanal crafts, right? Whereas Alberti is first, foremost, and almost wholly a man of letters.
Yeah.
And it does give the buildings a really weird quality, but that's quite exciting.
Yeah. A man of letters who understood perspective. And
I don't
wrote a book about it. Like,
I'm not saying he only did words, but
but understanding perspective in that point is someone who's got a real interest in the technique of drawing. But there's a weird disjunct, and he's a very different sort of character, yeah.
I can't help feeling like in a lot of the buildings, and perhaps this is the proportional system coming through. Well, one of the things he does is something which I kind of feel like a lot of sympathy for, as in I think, oh wow, that seems curiously like something which all architecture in its most unglamorous moment seems to be about, which is sort of working with the materials at hand, kind of taking sites and conditions which seem rather difficult and don't offer any prospect of any kind of lucid order, and finding some sort of bizarre geometrical schema by which they can be made to hang together. Perhaps the uncanniness of his projects also, it's weird because he has no drawings, because a lot of his projects seem to be almost overdrawn, don't they?
They're hypergraphical.
In the Rucellai, in the Santa Maria Novella, in a lot of these, it's like a building where, yeah, they're overdrawn, where the graphical seems to slightly overdetermine the sort of material, like tectonic outcome, and it gives it this almost virtual, hyper real quality.
The stuff that he's doing has got nothing to do with the way the buildings are built. And I don't mean that just to say that he wasn't designing the way the buildings were built. They're all like dressings. They don't speak to how the building actually is. Even where, you know, on the front of that church, it's built up. It's built up. He's just built another thing out of brick. He's built a new brick frame to which to dress.
Yeah.
And that combined with like strong theoretical basis is what kind of partly makes it look quite postmodern, because he's willing to like mash together different styles. He's not really interested in how things are made in that way, and it has to have this like sort of, there's this kind of categorical imperative of like, he's got to follow rules. The like proportional system will be made to work. No matter how, but like within all these constraints, and that is quite fun. I think that's what makes them quite interesting, that he's like really following his rule to the end.
At the same time, I find all of the accommodations that he makes with history, both as found and as, I don't know, sort of very...
It's like where there isn't a rule, die-hard rule, he can do anything.
There's something very sympathetic about that. I mean, as in, he literally seems like his design seems to espouse a kind of sympathy.
And I would say he clearly likes buildings. And isn't afraid to say it. Like, lots of architects, when they write theory, they have to be very down on all sorts of things to really only like the sort of thing they're talking about. He's very happy to have little moments of just liking stuff. This is exciting and good.
I feel like that is slightly rare as well, that people who are kind of canonical, who make a style, you think of them being a bit more absolutist and a bit more of a bastard, really. And he doesn't come across that way, at least in the way that he treats like historical architecture. Or, you know, not that he was necessarily nice to everyone he met, although he seems to have been rather charming. I love all this stuff of him going and like being delighted by all the old men, all this kind
of... I'm not convinced most of the people we talked about would be great company. I think they would be horrible, actually. It's sort of very difficult to deal with. All of these, he seems to have been like, yes, socially high functioning. Rather unusual.
A bit jaded about matters of like affairs of the heart, but not on like a complete hair trigger like all of these maniacal psychopaths he was actually building for.
There's another thing that's interesting about him, which is that he doesn't have much direct legacy immediately. He has an enormous amount of enduring legacy. People are always picking up the book every so often and things will come out, but they all seem quite indirect. Whereas, you know, Palazzo Medici Riccardi, copies of that all over the place. Built around the same sort of time, a little bit earlier, by Michelozzo. Much less striking building. Also not cheap, you know, but people didn't copy him, I think because it's such a sort of strange, striking thing to do. His method is not one that you can, like, pick up as a... There are some architects where if you go, okay, your client goes, I want it to be... Have you heard of this guy? I want it to kind of be like that. And, you know, I don't think he's one of those. It would be really difficult to make one. Whereas making one of those, you can make one of those. But, like, you can copy that. And it fits in all sorts of places.
But where does he go? He goes into the deep intellect. Yeah. And in a way, he does become like Vitruvius, doesn't he? He like becomes one of the people who people sort of circle back to and try to like recast and re-understand.
He's more interesting in Vitruvius because Vitruvius and him are both like vague, difficult to understand, and you can kind of cast him whatever like you want. But he also has a couple of interesting ideas, which Vitruvius has very few. I mean, there's interesting facts in Vitruvius. It's an interesting insight into a world.
As a piece of historical evidence, Vitruvius is interesting. It's important.
And actually, it's got some interesting... It's not quite as boring as I think we might make it out to be. It's not quite as terrible. It's not what you're looking for as an architecture student. It's definitely not that. Whereas he actually has some... He's got some guides on proportion, which are kind of fun and difficult to understand. He's funny, but he also has an idea of what like makes buildings interesting, which has some insight in it.
As a closing question, was the relationship between the built work and particularly the text that we talked about last episode, do we see a clear relationship? Is he carrying out the ideas that he expresses in the text?
My feeling is he is more than almost any other architect who we've read their theory of, because he will go like, the correct proportion for a door is this, and a door must be the same proportion as everything else, and then he'll do it. He'll say like a tomb should be this shape and covered in these things, and then he'll do it. And he'll say, you know, this sort of building should have the 3 orders on it going up, and then he did it. They're different sort of rules.
In terms of his more general like conception of beauty, do you think these buildings fulfill that idea?
I don't know, because I'm not sure if we totally got to the bottom of the vision of beauty. Because I think that his definition of beauty can be understood both in a very narrow, and I think we understood it in a more expansive way. That the very narrow interpretation is that he is just talking about proportion and symmetry, and that when he says that you can't take anything away without diminishing it, what it means is that there's a sort of harmonic relationship of the parts, and that they're symmetrical, and that they are bound together by that kind of that kind of very abstract and simple wholeness. Whereas I think we understood it, and I don't think we're wrong necessarily, like as being something much more qualitative. There are lots of different things working together and against each other. The process of discovering that is kind of exploratory and iterative rather than mathematical.
In the book, I had a sense that he was saying a number of things which were not really mutually compatible. You know, that you should draw from the existing environment and buildings, but that also the thing should become something seemed to be seeking a sort of adaptive, making harmony out of like an unharmonious world by bringing things naturally together. And others seem to be a sort of platonic, perfect shapes and harmonies in what was very much a fashionable philosophy of the day. Everyone's into this like platonic, Neoplatonic stuff back then, particularly the Medicis. And I'm not sure those visions are really mutually compatible. But that's not unusual. I mean, that's like people either have a internally coherent model that they completely ignore, or like is totally impossible, or they have some ideas that can sort of lead on to something. And
I think to go back to your first question, it's good that we have the text first and the buildings after. And I think what you see in the buildings is it's not that there's no connection, but you work out a whole different series of problems in the buildings, and that things take on different sort of scales and magnitudes, and not necessarily that he's contradicted himself, but the sort of terrain has expanded and contracted. He's sort of climbing up different sorts of mountains, or he's sort of delving into maybe what would have been the space between two sentences in the book.
I think the book and the buildings are answering slightly different questions. I don't think the book is incompatible with the buildings at all. I mean, I think the book is far more incompatible with itself than it is incompatible with its built works, which is probably a better way to be, actually.
So, goodbye to the sunlit valleys of northern Italy.
Yes, remember to keep hold of what animal protects you from lightning strikes?
It's an eagle.
Eagle. Also laurel tree. Laurel tree, easier to get hold of.
Easier and more portable.
Depends if you've got a decent falconer.
It's if you want to scare away crows that you burn the toad in the pot. That's the...
What's the shitting yourself one?
It's the lesbian enemy. I should have said that it's lesbian because it's from the Isle of Lesbos, not because of any connection to any kind of sexual orientation. So anyway, thanks for joining us. We will be recording some bonus content of some sort, which I think is going to cover... I think we're going to have a go at one of the great literary curiosities of the era, the Hypnerotomachia Polyphily, which is a book about being in love simultaneously with a woman and with the idea of architecture.
And in a dream, in a dream.
In a dream, in another dream. It's described simultaneously as being the most beautiful and the most boring book ever written.
So if that sounds down your alley, you can get that soon, and also voluminous other quantities of beautiful bonus content on our Patreon if you subscribe for just $3 a month. There's a good little back catalogue up there now.
Yeah, so that's at patreon.com/about_buildings. We're on various social media channels at about_buildings.
If anyone has any good insights or knows anything, unlike me, about Alberti, has any further insight about how he was communicating with the site and the site architect, I'd love to know a bit more about that and his working method.
Oh yeah, also in the not too distant future, we're going to do an episode about Zaha Hadid. And if any of you have any good stories or experiences, this being a more contemporary kind of piece of research, do drop us a line. We're happy to anonymise
Yeah, I think there's some. I've got some already that I think definitely have to be
there's
anonymized.
There's a lot of them around. Anyway, we'd be very interested to hear from you. Do drop us a line.
Thank
Bye.
you for
Good night.
listening.
Yeah.
Till next time.
Yeah. Good night.